presentation. Let's see. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Garza. I am a PhD student at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I am profusely honored to be here to discuss the highlights of my paper, Corporate Responsibility for Space, When Will It Matter, and Why? This paper was a result of my independent research of a dual master's, MBA, and MA graduate study with the Space Policy Institute. I have a lot to fit into 12 minutes, so let's jump right in. All right, I'd like to provide a very concise background on the two core areas that feed into the concepts we will discuss: corporate social responsibility and space sustainability. CSR, also sometimes referred to as sustainability management or corporate citizenship, is a management concept that requires a company to be socially accountable for impacts on the environment. For much of history, the gravity of enterprise impacts on the environment, especially of negative, have been ignored or accepted as unavoidable. Only in the last century has unmitigated impact become a staple of corporate governance for many of the world's leading firms, and is a virtual necessity for emerging companies and startups in certain industries. Most major firms have a chief sustainability officer or equivalent, elevating CSR to a sustained executive level effort. Now, given the audience here, I won't elaborate too much on the concept of space sustainability, but I do want to highlight two key ideas. Number one, as much as focus has increased on space sustainability in recent years, progress has been mostly on the geopolitical stage, with top-down responsibility falling on spacefaring nation states to implement norms and procedures. When these efforts do put pressure on industry, it exclusively affects space firms, space operators, satellite manufacturers, and launch service providers. Number two, non-space firms, or even space-dependent firms, are not currently concerned with space sustainability. As part of the research for my paper, I conducted a review of publicly available sustainability plans and strategies of Fortune 500 companies. Not a single one mentioned or even hinted at protecting the space environment. Even Amazon, which is the number 2 Fortune 500 company and is actively developing space services, does not address space sustainability in their public strategy. The collective position of sustainability managers, while typically robust for terrestrial concerns, appears to be indifferent to orbital affairs. Now, this is by no means a direct critique of non-space firms. Most do not consider space sustainability because they have not been presented with a business need to do so. That begs the question, though, what will it take to make space part of the corporate sustainability portfolio? In a seminal and comprehensive planning report, the Center for Ethical Business Cultures conducted a historical review and analysis to determine the drivers of the evolution of CSR. They arrived at 5 areas or lenses through which an economy or an industry can be examined for CSR catalysts. They are the impact of the business on its environment, transformation of the business environment, evolution of CSR strategies, development of CSR strategies, and current topics in CSR. This allows us to view space sustainability through these lenses and discuss parallels with terrestrial environmentalism. Now, in the interest of time and depth of discussion, we will group lenses 3, 4, and 5 together, as they are all associated with CSR concepts and theory and their application to a given industry. Other lenses are far more influential at this stage in CSR for space evolution, and those lenses first need to coalesce into the ideal environment for development of commercial space sustainability strategies and theory. I invite you to read further detail in the paper, but we'll focus for now on lenses 1 and 2. So to help visualize the impact of a business on the environment, this slide shows a popular CSR concept known as the sustainability iceberg. So the tip of the iceberg above the surface is a firm's core business and their internal operations. However, especially in a globalized economy, a company's impact goes far below the surface. The firm's environmental footprint expands as they use their supply chain, engage in business partnerships, and drive or participate in norms for their industry. For non-space firms and even space-dependent firms, a chief sustainability officer may not think that they would ever affect the space environment, or that it wouldn't really matter if they did. In reality, we are on the verge of an infiltration of space services into supply chain impacts all over the world. We're only a few years from on-orbit servicing, active debris removal, on-orbit manufacturing, space tourism, and more advanced remote sensing and communications being used by a far wider web of business-to-business networks. That means that within that same time frame, thousands of firms around the world will have space sustainability impacts creep below their surface without truly being aware of their responsibility. For Lens 2, the CEBC report further deconstructed this lens into 6 sub-areas that historically have driven the transportation of the business environment. We've already touched on some of these, and I again direct you to the paper for more detail, but I'd like to focus on the last 3: public opinion, strategic investment, and codes and standards. Public opinion is historically influential and potentially the strongest driver for transformation. At any moment, a single incident can turn public sentiment against an industry or a sector, and firms are forced to respond or risk losing revenue. Given the public admiration and prestige for the civil space program and now space tourism, space sustainability could be thrust into public conversation if a sufficiently traumatic event occurred, such as a debris incident or collision resulting in the destruction of the International Space Station. Knock on wood. A similar response could also come from a major or long-term loss of service like GPS. As undesirable as these events are, if the triggering incidents were caused by corporate irresponsibility, particularly from a major firm, the force of public opinion could likely create CSR for space overnight. For strategic investment, space is already attracting significant venture capital, raising record amounts even during a pandemic, with venture capital firms betting on both traditional space services and some of the emerging services previously discussed. Investors themselves, however, can also be a significant factor in the development of CSR for space if the investment culture shifts accordingly. And we'll talk about a terrestrial parallel here in a second. For codes and standards, I also conducted a review of the United States Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which issues industry-specific sustainability guidelines, and the Global Sustainability Standards Board, which manages the standards for sustainability reporting. There is no mention of space sustainability or even the space industry with either organization. Of note, the SASB industry-specific guide for telecommunications specifically mentions the satellites that support the industry, yet they do not address any aspect of satellite launch or operations. We already had a pretty good discussion earlier about the space sustainability rating. Comparing space with fossil fuel on Earth during the rise of CSR, space is significantly more transparent, but yet operators still lean towards irresponsibility. The space sustainability ratings will help, no doubt about it, but as important and critical and valuable as the ratings are, again, they're aimed exclusively at space firms and have no real weight or even visibility with enterprise as a whole. So, terrestrial parallels. What can the history of CSR here on Earth teach us about space sustainability? There are several analogs, but there is only one in my mind that matters. On March 24th, 1989, the Exxon Valdez struck a reef 2.4 kilometers west of Alaska. It spilled 10.8 million gallons of oil into the sea, affected 2,100 kilometers of coastline, and killed hundreds of thousands of birds and sea creatures. Another major impact, it is viewed as the single point catalyst that gave birth to corporate social responsibility as we know it. Public opinion shifted drastically. This affected bottom lines, and the capitalists who bet big on those bottom lines decided to be more strategic in their investments. In fact, after Exxon Valdez, a group of investors created the Coalition for Environmentally Responsible Economies. This organization went on to create corporate sustainability reporting as we know it, and more importantly, as highlighted in the previous slide for Lens 2, they shifted the investment culture of an entire industry to favor environmentally conscious firms. Progress, great, but unfortunately such progress necessitated a disaster. So what does that tell us for the future of space sustainability and CSR for space? Terrestrial CSR has been historically reactionary. Low Earth orbit cannot afford an Exxon Valdez catalyst to create CSR for space. Major disasters could potentially disrupt services for months, and sufficiently large debris-causing events could ruin operational orbits for years. The damage would already be done, and cleanup and repair options would be extremely limited, and as of today, nearly all of these options are still in development. It is critically necessary that space sustainability become a staple of CSR as a strong preventative mechanism. So what do we do to proactively develop CSR for space? We can spread awareness and directly engage chief sustainability officers to engage and explore opportunities within a firm's footprint, beginning with space-dependent companies, and we can incorporate those space-dependent firms into space policy and international governance and acknowledge their sustainability influence. We can continue to develop the sustainability ratings and develop space industry standards, encourage investment with responsible space actors, and lastly, and by all means, do not wait for a disaster to spark progress. Encourage and advocate for CSR for space and sustainable investment as preemptive initiatives. History has taught us the lesson of reactionary environmentalism. Progress comes, but usually at a cost that could have been avoided with responsible behavior from the start. This research has shown that currently there is no real presence of space or CSR for space in any of the mediums that communicate, monitor, or manage corporate sustainability. While governments have a major role to play, industry can also act independently. Space sustainable firms could supplement top-down government influence with bottom-up or horizontal economic influence. This would likely advance space sustainability further and quicker than government initiatives alone. We can and should support the development of this new sustainability landscape, and the space sector can grow with responsible use while minimizing the risk of catastrophe. I'd like to thank the IAF for the opportunity and to the session chairs for the opportunity to speak, and my thanks to you for your interest. My contact info is there. Please do get in touch if you'd like to discuss CSR for space or trustworthy AI for space sustainability, which is my PhD focus. Thank you.
I'm Walter from Assistant. We worked on ESG also, so I was wondering, as the future viewers, we're learning the investments, CSR, ESG. Why did you choose to focus this study on CSR versus ESG? As we found that CSR was less quantitative than ESG, and therefore ESG could be maybe more applicable to the space sector to attract the investment and push forward for space sustainability.
Sure, that's a great question. So you're right. It is hard to quantify, and it's even hard to define, right? Like some sustainability managers within large firms don't even define sustainability as environmentally related. They define sustainability as sustaining their business footprint and their business market, right? So that's exactly why I focused on that, because this is not directed at the space sector alone, but at all firms who are going to eventually have space services somewhere below their surface of that iceberg, right? And sustainability managers need to start becoming aware of what that means and how they might be supporting good or bad, highly rated or low rated space sustainability missions and firms. So that's a great question.
I think you correctly pointed out that companies serve on the front lines, and in order to implement some of your recommendations, have you given a thought whose responsibility should that be? Are you imagining that the Treasury Department or the Ministry of Finance, that they drive a regulatory mechanism, or do you implement some kind of detailed component?
So that's going to be I think regulatory force is going to be a factor no matter what. But again, looking at the way CSR evolved previously, with environmental disasters and whatnot, the driver really came from the source of money, right? Like follow the money. If capitalists or venture capitalists are not willing to give up their investment dollars to non-sustainable firms, then those firms are going to be forced to pay attention to it, and it's going to be, the responsibility isn't. It's hard to define that because it's not going to fall on any given organization. It's really going to be a culture shift and a trend shift across business and across enterprise. So, thank you. Yes. Yes. Yep.